I guess I've been disarmed. Hey everyone, so in swords fighting and anything really, then hand injuries are very common. This is a little bit dramatic because I've got an unstable finger fracture, so I'm just waiting for orthopedics to clear me out of this cast, which hopefully happens soon. But in swordsmanship, then it's very often that hand injuries, arm injuries happen, and sometimes they even get cut off. So if you're an Asian swordsman and you lose one of your hands, is that the end of your career? And so they base the question, can you use an Asian katana with one hand? And the answer is quite clearly yes. If you look at draw cutting, then you do a quite powerful, quite fast cut with one hand from the sheath. And if you look at Musashi's Book of Five Rings, then he quite clearly advocates for people to use katanas in one hand. He uses two swords, and he even trains with two katanas, one in either hand. And he states that gives you strong arms, gives you good control of both, and he trains you well. And he says that when using two swords, then if you really need the power, you can drop one of them, put both hands on a sword, and then cut. And there's a few advantages of using katana with one hand. And one main advantage of it is reach. So if you see I'm holding it with two hands, then I've got a certain amount of reach. And it's quite limited because my body is quite square on, because I've got to have both hands on the sword. Whereas if my bottom hand is suddenly free, because I'm using it one-handed, then I can take a much more side-on view, and I can have a lot more reach. So from here, compared to here. Another advantage of using a sword one-handed is that you've got one free hand. You can have another sword, you can have a shield, you can grapple, you can use it to throw dust in your opponent's eyes if that's what you want to do. You can do a lot of things with the free hand. And now if you look at ancient swordsman fighting, then there were schools that used two swords, one-handed katana use, and so forth, but it wasn't actually very common. Most people used this two-handed sword with two hands. So if there's these advantages, then why didn't everyone go for it? Why didn't everyone do it? And it's because there's a few downsides. When you've got such a long, heavy blade like the katana, then it's quite unwieldy in one hand. You don't have the agility, and the main thing that you don't have is the ability to change directions. So when you do a draw cut, you see it comes out, it's a preset cut, and when you start, then you know exactly what you're going to do, and you finish there. Whereas when you're fighting against someone else who fights back, then generally you want to be able to stop, change directions, change your cuts. And when you're using a very heavy blade like a katana with one hand, it's got a very far forward weight balance. It just doesn't happen. Now some people say if you look at Western blades, like you see rapiers, they're a one-handed blade that's got a very long blade length. Some of them even have a longer blade length than the entire katana, including the handle. Why can they do it and why can't we? And the answer lies in the pommel and the thinness and the lightness of their blade. So they've got a pommel as a counterbalance, helps them get a little bit more of that agility and moves the weight balance closer to the guard, not so far forward. And then they've also got a much thinner, lighter blade than the katana. Katana's got a very fat spine, it's a very thick, heavy blade. But what they sacrifice there is the cutting power of the katana. Because the katana has a very far forward weight balance, then it cuts much heavier, and it's got a lot more force in that cut. And because of that, then you sacrifice a little bit of agility for a stronger cut. So the next point we come to is power loss. You get a lot of power loss when you use a sword with one hand as opposed to two. It seems pretty obvious, but there's a record of it in General JiGuang's JiXiaoXinShu, which I probably butchered the pronunciation of, but it's basically the new treatise of military efficiency written from 1560 to 1580. And there's a quote talking about Japanese swordsmanship when they came over and they used their nodachi with two hands and a very long handle. And they said their two-handed sword technique was so powerful that one of our soldiers was sliced in two. The force was strong when used with both hands. And it goes to say that you get the push-pull motion, and that gives you a lot more power as well as a lot more speed compared to a one hand where you've just got the wrist flick. And so then despite this downside of losing power, losing agility, losing speed, seemingly all the things that you want in swordsmanship, and if you go outside of Japan, you go to Korea and you go to China, then they did have these blades that they used with one hand. And there's a record of the Korean sword where it says that the handle was 1 foot long and the blade was 3 to 4 feet long. Now there's a little bit of ambiguity whether the foot was referring to the modern equivalent of the Asian foot, which is about 30.3 centimeters, or if it was referring to an older version which was 21 centimeters. And Dr Bok Kyu Choi, he's one of the world leading experts in Korean ancient swordsmanship. He tends to lead to 21 centimeters in one of his papers. And he doesn't actually give much explanation for that, but I tend to agree with him, because if you look in the Book of Corrections, which has a record of the Indian War, which happened from 1592 to 1598, then it says Japanese swords were readily pressed into service just by trimming off the handle. And so then if you've got a Japanese sword with a handle length of about 30 centimeters and you cut it, it really makes sense that it goes down to about 21 centimeters and you've still got the same blade length. So why did the Koreans use these long katana-like weapons with shorter handles? And the answer is because not everything is about swordsmanship, especially on the battlefield. When you look at Korean military tactics, then before the Indian War, then they didn't even teach swordsmanship to their soldiers. They had no formal training for swordsmanship. They only had formal training for archery. And so they just believed that if you give someone a sword, they'll know how to use it, which is not quite true. But because they focus so heavily on archery, then you can imagine that if you had a bow in your left hand and suddenly someone comes close enough to you that you need to use your sword, you don't want to have to drop your bow every time. So you want to have a sword that you can use in one hand and then use your bow as your main weapon. Now, Koreans love their bows so much that you see Japanese tachi would have been hung this way. The Koreans used a little swivel so that their sword hung this way because they didn't want the handle getting in the way of their bow. And it's a little bit off topic, but you can see that using a one-hand sword might be advantageous if it's not your main weapon, as it was in those cases. So using a katana one-handed, yes, definitely possible. If you've lost your other hand, probably no other choice. Definitely doable. There are many disadvantages, but there are some advantages, and it's a bit of a trade-off. People like Musashi, who advocated for using two swords, obviously had the body type and the training and the skills that leaned in favor of the advantages of the one-hand sword as opposed to the two-hand sword, whereas most people generally felt the katana was meant to be a two-handed sword and used it as such. And so even in Korea after the Indian War, then you see them transition to using swords two-handed because they saw the advantages of the two-handed sword. And you see that where in Muyedobotongji, where they start adding in skills like JiXiaoXinShu and things like that, where they've got two hands on a relatively same size sword. So in summary, then yes, you can use a katana one-handed, and if you've lost a hand, no choice, yep, you've got to. But it's also not necessarily the greatest thing to do, and it doesn't mean that everyone should jump onto using two swords or using a sword with one hand and having a shield or anything else. So I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time.